It's wild how a movie like The Matrix gets everyone asking, what if this is all a simulation?
Right.
But today, well, you sent us something way deeper.
Oh, yeah.
A whole text file from a programmer.
Wow.
And get this, they actually build simulations for a living.
That's a pretty unique perspective to be coming from.
For sure. So our deep dive today is going to be all about how someone who creates these simulated worlds, how they think about the possibility that we might be in one.
It really is fascinating. Most of the time when we talk about simulation theory, it's all, pretty philosophical and abstract.
Yeah.
But this is coming from someone who's dealing with the nuts and bolts of it every day.
Yeah.
The code, the limits of what you can program, how we actually interact with these simulated environments.
You know what really hooked me right away? That part where they're talking about just looking at a computer screen.
Okay, yeah.
We don't even think about it, right? But they break it down like it's already a simulation.
It all comes down to this idea of abstraction. Every single thing you see on that screen, every image, every icon, it's actually representing a ton of really complex processes happening in the code.
Right.
It's like a whole world inside the machine, but we're only seeing this simplified version of it.
So even something as basic as my laptop screen is showing me what, like a constructed reality, not the actual raw data?
Exactly. What you're seeing is several steps removed from how complex it really is. It's kind of like, imagine you're trying to describe all of New York City, but you can only use a subway map. You'd get some information, sure.
Okay.
But it wouldn't be the whole picture, right?
I get it. And then they connect this idea of abstraction to something they call workflows, those pre-programmed paths in software.
Yeah.
And they bring up the biggest question ever, free will.
Whoa.
I mean, if our lives are a simulation, do we really have any control over our choices?
And the source uses a specific example, an employee database that they actually worked on. And they talk about how the users, they can make choices, right? Like input data, make reports, but they're always stuck within the limits of that software.
So they have choices, but only certain ones.
Exactly. And that's where it gets all philosophical and tricky. Because if we are in some kind of simulation, are we really making free choices? Or are we just operating within the rules of the universe's software?
This is already blowing my mind, but they also talk about how even the programming languages themselves and even the hardware have limitations.
Right.
But then again, computers keep getting more powerful all the time.
All the time, yeah.
So wouldn't that mean that eventually we could have simulations that are totally realistic?
Absolutely. I mean, the source makes a great point about how technology just keeps evolving.
For sure.
Think about video games, right? They used to be all blocky pixels, and now you've got these incredible, almost photorealistic environments.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And if that keeps going, who knows what kinds of simulations we'll be able to create in the future? I mean, the potential is pretty mind-blowing.
Okay, this part totally threw me. They talk about this tangled cable epiphany.
What?
Yeah, they were dealing with a bunch of tangled cables, like everyone does, and it made them think about reality being controlled by probability. I don't even know how to explain that one.
It is a pretty wild analogy, right? But they realized that even something seemingly random, like those cables getting all tangled up, it might actually be the most likely outcome based on just how the system works.
Yeah.
Cables tend to get messy unless you intentionally keep them organized.
So are they saying that maybe what we call randomness in our lives is actually just a bunch of probabilities we don't get yet, that there's some kind of code, but we can't see it?
Well, that's kind of the million-dollar question they're trying to wrap their head around.
Yeah.
They don't pretend to have all the answers.
Right.
But they make this really interesting point. If you start looking at the world like a programmer, it kind of changes how you think about those big questions.
I can see that. We usually think of randomness as, totally unpredictable. But what if it's all about probabilities and we just haven't figured out the pattern yet?
That's where their whole background as a programmer comes in. They're so used to thinking about systems and algorithms and how probability plays into all of it.
Of course.
So it's natural for them to apply that same kind of logic to this whole, is our reality a simulation thing?
Yeah.
You
know what else I thought was cool? How they talked about changing the probability of finding a tangled mess by actually organizing those cables.
Right.
It's they literally took control of the system just by understanding how it works.
Exactly. And that's a pretty powerful idea, right? What if we are living in some kind of simulation? Could we learn the rules, figure out the code, and then actually use that knowledge to our advantage?
Whoa, hold on a sec. We got to be careful here.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, the source never actually says they believe we're in a simulation.
Yeah, you're totally right. They're very careful about that. It's more like a thought experiment.
Okay.
A way to kind of poke at these big ideas without saying, this is definitely the answer. It's about getting us to think critically.
Yeah.
And to question what we think we know about reality.
Which is important because it's easy to get lost in all the what ifs.
Definitely.
And forget that we don't actually have concrete answers yet.
And I think that's really the whole point of this deep dive. We're not trying to reach some big conclusion about simulation theory.
Right.
It's more about engaging with the ideas, exploring the possibilities, and getting a better understanding of how complex systems actually work, whether it's a computer program or, the entire universe.
So even if we never figure out if we're in a simulation or not, there's still value in thinking about it this way?
Absolutely. The source is encouraging us to really think about the systems we interact with all the time.
Yeah.
To question how they work and to be open to the idea that maybe there's more to reality than what we can see.
I'm starting to see why this programmer's perspective is so different. It's like they're constantly going from the super tiny details of code to these massive questions about the universe.
Yeah, it's a really unique way of looking at things.
For sure.
They bring this whole level of technical knowledge to these philosophical questions that you don't usually see.
Right.
And that's what makes it so interesting to think about.
I know I'm going to look at my phone totally differently now.
Oh, yeah.
Like every time I open an app, I'm going to be thinking about all that code underneath and the choices I'm making, even if they're limited by the system.
It's awesome. And it connects to this idea that the simulations we create are just getting more and more complex.
Okay.
I mean, as technology keeps getting better, it's getting harder to tell the difference between what's real and what's virtual.
Yeah, that's kind of freaky.
Which makes that whole question, are we in a simulation, even more mind-blowing, right?
It's pretty amazing how this whole conversation has gone from computer screens to tangled up cables and from free will to like the future of simulations.
It's been a journey.
For real. But the thing that keeps sticking with me is how the source emphasizes that the more realistic a simulation is, well, that depends on how powerful the computers are.
Yeah, it's all about computing power, isn't it? They talk about how much it's grown just in the past few decades. It's crazy to think that what used to take up a whole room can now fit in your pocket.
Right. And it just keeps getting faster and smaller.
Exactly. And the source uses that to think about like the possibilities of simulation theory.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, if we, with our current technology, can already build these virtual worlds that feel so real, just imagine what a civilization that's like way more advanced than us could do.
Okay, now we're getting into sci-fi territory.
Aha! I know, right?
But the source actually brings it back down to earth by talking about how this stuff applies to programmers and people who design systems, like in the real world.
Oh, totally. They talk about how understanding things like abstraction, the limits of code, all of that can help us build better systems.
Makes sense.
It doesn't matter if it's designing a website that's easier to use or building a financial model that actually predicts what the market will do.
Right.
These concepts have really practical uses.
So even if we never figure out for sure if we're in a simulation or not, thinking about this stuff can still make us better at what we do.
Absolutely. It's all about expanding how we think about the world, looking at things from different angles. The programmer's perspective is just one way to do that, but it's a really interesting one.
I agree. What I like is that they don't shy away from those big what-if cauldrons.
For sure.
But they always use examples from their own work to make it feel more grounded.
It makes it feel less like, just a theory and more like, well, something real that we can actually wrap our heads around.
Exactly. And that's kind of what this whole show is about, isn't it? Taking these complex ideas from different sources and trying to unpack them.
It's a deep dive for sure.
And finding those little bits of insight that might, change how we think about things, even in a small way.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So to everyone listening, now that we've explored simulation theory through the eyes of a programmer, here's something to think about. What if our reality is a simulation? Could we use our knowledge of programming, probability, the way systems work to hack the system, maybe even escape it?
Whoa, that's a whole other deep dive right there.
Right. But for now, I'd encourage you to go back to the source material with all these new ideas in mind.
Yeah, it's amazing what you can discover when you look at something from a different perspective.
Absolutely.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive into simulation theory. But the conversation doesn't have to end here. Keep those questions coming and keep exploring. Who knows, maybe you'll be the one to figure out the secrets of reality. Until next time.